Good day.
Today is Tuesday, 20th May 2025, and obviously I am still in St. Petersburg, that this will be my last night here, my last evening here. I've had a very, very busy day indeed. I've been at the legal forum. I've had some time in the city itself. I've gained an awful lot of impressions about both the mood and the overall condition of certainly St. Petersburg itself, and perhaps of the larger country. Whilst I have been here, I'm extremely grateful to my hosts, but I'm going to go straight into this program today, the subject of this program, because time is short and I'd like to deal with the substance of recent events. I'm going to quickly make two observations following up on things I said about my trip yesterday. The first is that my view that there has been an overall consolidation of Russian society has been reinforced by the many wider contacts I have had over the course of today. My second comment is that yesterday I said that it seemed to me as if there'd been a significant increase in wealth here in Russia. To repeat again, I have only visited St. Petersburg, so I'm not speaking about the whole of Russia. But again, that was certainly the impression I got from spending time in St. Petersburg itself. I saw no visible signs of any economic distress here. On the contrary, compared to the situation that I used to see previously, I would say that there are clearly signs of a significant increase in general material prosperity, though perhaps it's worth pointing out that the last time I was in St. Petersburg, as opposed to Russia, was in 2016, and that, of course, was 9 years ago. So perhaps the fact that there has been an increase in general prosperity since that time is unsurprising. Anyway, I will say a lot more in my next program. I will probably have a discussion about my impressions about the situation here in Russia over the course of a specific program I'm likely to do on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Today, as I said, I would like to focus on the big news, which was the telephone conversation which took place yesterday between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Now, this conversation bears all the hallmarks of having been arranged in some haste, just 10 days before, roughly 10 days before the conversation took place. All the talk was of the United States, of Donald Trump joining the Europeans in an ultimatum that required Russia to agree to an unconditional ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine on Monday, 12th May. And the assumption was that, it wasn't the assumption, the statements were that if that didn't happen, then massive sanctions would be imposed upon Russia. And I think it is now well established that the Europeans had coordinated work on this ultimatum, this joint ultimatum, which they presented as having been agreed with the Americans, with at least some American officials, probably with General Kellogg, almost certainly with General Kellogg, at least that's my own view, and unquestionably with Senator Lindsey Graham, who has a major sanctions package which has been prepared in Congress, and which he says has the support of 72 senators. And then what happened on the following day was that Vladimir Putin, late at night, or to be precise, early on Sunday morning, rejected the ultimatum, rejected the call for an unconditional ceasefire, basically called the Europeans' bluff, and said that what Russia instead proposed to do was to send an official delegation to go to Istanbul on Thursday, the 15th of May, and if provided the Ukrainians turned up, to engage the Ukrainians in direct talks aimed at finding a peaceful solution to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And to reiterate again, the European leaders, four of whom, Macron, Starmer, Merz, and Tusk, who were at that time in Kiev, together with Zelensky, all initially said that this proposal of Putin's was unacceptable, that there had to be a ceasefire first before negotiations. They were supported in this view by General Kellogg, who said the same thing in a message he posted on X. And then everything was thrown into confusion when a short time later, Donald Trump issued two messages on Truth Social saying that Putin's comments appeared to be a breakthrough and that the Ukrainians absolutely needed to attend in Istanbul and to meet with the Russians there and to engage with them in negotiations. And then we had a very complicated and extraordinary week of diplomatic activity. I'm not sure diplomatic activity is quite the word that I would use. I have described at length, and we have discussed at length on the Duran, the extraordinary gyrations that Vladimir Zelensky went through as he first said that he wanted to speak to Putin personally in Istanbul, but would only do so if there was a ceasefire. And then he walked that back and said he wanted to speak with Vladimir Putin, but he wouldn't speak with anyone else, that no one was authorized on behalf of Ukraine to speak with the Russians. But then eventually he went to not to Istanbul at all, but to Ankara, even as the Russian delegation arrived in Istanbul. He kept the Russians waiting for 24 hours. He had a 3-hour meeting with President Erdogan of Turkey. And with a great show of reluctance, he authorized a Ukrainian delegation to go to Istanbul, where they did indeed meet with the Russians, where the Russians essentially restated all of their fundamental positions. Now, after that, Donald Trump again weighed in. He said that the conflict needed to be solved through direct talks between himself and Vladimir Putin, and it was this which led to the conversation that took place yesterday. Now, in advance of those talks, just a few hours before they took place, I said in the video that I made yesterday that I anticipated that eventually there would be a summit meeting, an actual summit meeting between Putin and Trump, that the Russians perhaps would not in the normal circumstances have particularly wanted a summit meeting at this time, but that the need to explain the situation to Trump made it probably imperative from a Russian point of view that an actual physical meeting take place between Putin and Trump, in which Putin could explain to Trump, firstly, that Russia would not be intimidated by sanctions, by further sanctions, that if such sanctions were imposed, they would not end the war, they would prolong it, and they would destroy the relationship between Russia and the United States. Secondly, that the Russian position, the one set out, which he set out in Istanbul, the one that he set out in his speech to the foreign ministry on the 14th of June 2024, which I have described as Istanbul Plus, is for real, and that the Russian delegation's restatement of those conditions, those terms, which took place when the Russians did meet with the Ukrainians in Istanbul, that is for real also. So I said that was what I thought would happen, that Putin would actually probably agree to a meeting with Donald Trump. Now, in the hours since then, we have heard no information that a meeting was in fact agreed between Donald Trump and Putin over the course of this call. However, all of the information we have had from this call, both from Vladimir Putin himself, unusually, the Russians have not provided a readout of the call. Instead, what we got was Putin coming out of his residence in Sochi on the Black Sea, where he was when the call took place, and Putin meeting with the media and giving his own account of the telephone call, an account which has been elaborated on by Putin's aide, Ushakov. Anyway, what we have learnt about the call makes me think that a meeting with Trump, between Putin and Trump, is indeed going to take place over the course of the next few weeks, but that the Russians, probably to their relief, found Trump much more attentive and interested in what they had to say than they perhaps anticipated. So Putin came out of the meeting. He said that they'd had this discussion, that Putin had explained the position clearly. He said that Russia is now involved in a negotiation process with Ukraine. Hopefully, that will lead to a satisfactory end to the conflict. That maybe, just maybe, out of these talks which are taking place, if the talks go well, or if progress is made over the course of the talks, then absolutely it might be that, provided, as I said, there's actual progress and that the conditions for a ceasefire are satisfied and that ceasefire is conducive to further progress, then temporary ceasefires might indeed be agreed as part of this process. The Russians will not agree to a ceasefire before the negotiation process properly gets underway, but the Russians have said that they are by no means averse in principle to a ceasefire. And Putin reminded Trump that, in fact, at the meeting in Istanbul, the Russians and the Ukrainians each agreed that they would each present to the other their own ideas for how a ceasefire might be agreed and how it might take place. So these are the things that Putin said to Trump. And he said to Trump also, and this appears to have been perhaps the thing that pleased Trump most, that the Russians not only are serious about wanting a negotiation and a successful negotiation, but that they want this process to proceed as quickly as possible. They're not going to be rushed, but they don't want this thing to take too much time. They're prepared to agree some kind of framework agreement with the Ukrainians and perhaps with the Americans, though I'm not sure about the second, some kind of framework agreement about how the talks will be conducted, what sort of topics will be agreed, and some kind of timeline perhaps will be discussed and perhaps even agreed between the Russians and the Ukrainians, though it is not absolutely clear how tight that timeline is supposed to be, or, by the way, how inflexible it is supposed to be. Well, Trump appears to have been very pleased with what he heard. He said that the way to move forward, and this is what he basically said on his message in Truth Social, the way to move forward is to allow the Ukrainians and the Russians to move forward with the negotiations, not to interfere or meddle with the negotiations, not to apply unnecessary pressure, just to give this negotiating process, which has now started, time and space in order to play out, and so that the United States can see where it's going. Now, some people have interpreted this to mean that the United States is going to pull out completely from involving itself in the negotiations. I don't really see that that was what Donald Trump said at all, at least not in his Truth Social message. Perhaps that is what Trump should do. But as I said, I'm not convinced that that is what his message on Truth Social actually conveyed. And, others have perhaps put too much weight on Trump's words that the Ukrainians and the Russians have agreed to talk to each other immediately. Some appear to assume that, again, Trump was expecting that the Russians and the Ukrainians would resume their talks the following day or something like that. Again, I think this is the kind of loose language that Donald Trump sometimes engages in. I think the only point that was being made here, again, is that these are negotiations. The negotiations are already underway. There will be a follow-up meeting very soon. In effect, the negotiations are happening now. Anyway, that was my impression. And Ushakov said it was a friendly call. Putin said it was a frank and honest one. And Donald Trump said it was a good call. And it went on for 2 hours. So they clearly discussed it all very thoroughly, in apparently a very friendly way, which suggests, as I said, to me that Putin felt that he was given time and space to put forward all of his explanations, and that Trump was attentive and was listening and proactive and no doubt asked his questions too. They didn't just talk about the negotiations. They talked about other things. They talked about developing future trade between their countries, something that Trump apparently is very excited about. So overall, it was a good call. Better, I think, as I said, than what the Russians expected or feared that it would be. I say feared. To repeat again, if Trump had insisted that Russia announce an unconditional ceasefire immediately, the Russians would have rejected it. And if Trump had announced that he was going to support Lindsey Graham's bone-crunching sanctions, the Russians would still have been defiant, confident that they would be able to ride out those sanctions. But the Russians were not looking to provoke further sanctions upon themselves. That would have made no sense. They prefer to have a dialogue with the United States. They want that dialogue to be long-term. They fear that the previous situation, the one which existed with Joe Biden, when there were no contacts of substance between the United States and Russia, the world's two biggest nuclear powers, was an inherently dangerous one. And the Russians, for their own security and for the stability of the international system, which of course has an effect on their own security and stability in other places like the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere. They would prefer definitely to have a dialogue with the United States, and they would prefer definitely to be able to come to some kind of consensus with the United States on many, many issues, but eventually perhaps also over the issue of Ukraine. They're not going to run. My sense is that the Russians, the mood in Russia, is that though they're not going to run away from confrontation with the Americans, if they are given no choice, they are not looking for unnecessary confrontation. If they can come to an understanding, so much the better. Why not, provided Russian national interests are not sacrificed? And over the course of the call, Putin again said that the objective was to agree a peace agreement which would address the root causes of the conflict. In other words, the package that Putin outlined at his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024 remains in effect. He wants all of those various things that he set out there. No NATO membership for Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, denuclearization of Ukraine, what the Russians call denazification of Ukraine, and above all, a Ukraine outside NATO and non-aligned and categorically neutral. And obviously now the territorial issue, the four regions settled on Russian terms, with Russia recognizing these four regions as, Ukraine recognizing these four regions as Russian. Well, Putin still wants to achieve all of those things, and he hopes that with the help of the Americans, he will achieve them. But if the Americans get in the way and oppose them, well, as I said, he's not going to run away and capitulate on any of that. So anyway, a good, productive call. We have another reason for knowing that it was a good, productive call, because in the hours after the conversation took place, Donald Trump called a series of leaders in Europe, and he also called President Zelensky of Ukraine, and he briefed all of them on the call. And none of them were happy. We've had comments about this from the Financial Times. Two people briefed on the call with the European leaders, and one would love to know who these two people were. Were they Europeans or were they Americans? Two people briefed on the call with the European leaders said Trump was clear he would pull the US back from engaging with the conflict and leave Ukraine and Russia to directly negotiate a ceasefire. Again, there's so much misrepresentation here because the negotiations are not about a ceasefire. They're about a final settlement of the conflict. The British media in particular always takes us back to the topic of a ceasefire, as if that was the only topic that was being discussed. Whereas in fact, as the Russians have made clear, the objective is not a ceasefire. It is a final settlement of the conflict. But then we go on to read, Trump also made no promise of future US sanctions against Russia should Putin refuse any peace attempts. And when you talked about peace attempts, again, notice the, shall we say, manipulative language. Previously, they talk about a ceasefire when the negotiations, as I say, are in fact not about a ceasefire at all, but about getting a final settlement of the conflict. At least that is the Russian position. But then the next sentence directly says that there'll be no sanctions from the US if Putin should refuse any peace attempts. So we see here that there is this attempt to try to conflate a ceasefire with peace and not talk about a final settlement, which I would say logically is the only possible pathway to a sustainable peace. But then we go on to read, one person familiar with the conversation said the leaders were stunned by the US president's description of what was agreed. They added it was clear Trump was not ready to put greater pressure on Putin to come to the negotiating table in earnest. So Putin suggests negotiations in Istanbul. Zelensky attempts to avoid those negotiations. He won't negotiate with anybody but Putin. He won't let anybody speak to the Russians apart from himself, and he's not going to speak with the Russians if Putin isn't there. He insists on a ceasefire first before the negotiations. He storms off in a huff when he's told that he has to send a negotiating team, and does so reluctantly. But it is Putin, supposedly, who is reluctant to engage in earnest in negotiations, not Zelensky. Now, again, as I said, the writers of the Financial Times obviously have a right to their point of view, but I find, again, their point of view as expressed here, in light of the events of the last week, a strange one. Just saying. Anyway, let's move on. So the European leaders, we're told, were stunned by the call. And someone else made pretty clear how he feels about the call, and that was Zelensky, because directly after Trump spoke to him, Zelensky set out his own opinions in a statement. Ukraine has a right to join NATO. It must join NATO. Ukraine has to have all its territory back, including Crimea. Ukraine will never accept anything less than the return of all of its territory, including Crimea. And effectively, Zelensky ruled out any concessions, any compromises with the Russians whatsoever, even though he again insisted that a ceasefire must be agreed. If this attitude, by the way, is maintained, then I don't really see how these negotiations can succeed. But if that does also happen, then as far as I can see, it will be impossible to deny the fact to the Americans that it is Zelensky, in effect, who is the prime obstacle to negotiations to achieve a peace settlement, since the demands that he is making, virtually everyone else, the Americans and the Europeans, acknowledge are unrealistic and therefore unreasonable. But anyway, let's not move too far ahead. The Europeans are stunned. Zelensky obviously is furious. I mean, the fact that he's spoken out in this strong way, he's issued this kind of very strong statement, tells us how unhappy he clearly was with the substance of the telephone call between Putin and Trump. And since then, the Financial Times has provided a follow-up report. It said that in the hours following the briefing of the European leaders by Donald Trump, all of the European leaders were busy phoning each other, talking about what to do. They were also busy phoning Zelensky. There was apparently a whole day of discussion and I suspect recrimination and argument about the way forward. We're told by the Financial Times that they are desperate to keep the Americans still engaged, which is code for saying that they're still desperate to try to find ways to recommit the United States to open-ended support of Ukraine. But they're starting to despair of how to do it. In the meantime, they have, of course, gone ahead and announced their next sanctions package. In the case of the European Union, it is the 17th in the series. The British, of course, have also joined in. All sorts of individuals and companies are now being sanctioned, and there are attempts also to sanction Russia's so-called shadow fleet. I'm not going to discuss these sanctions in this program. The sanctions are going to be completely ineffectual. India has just confirmed, by the way, that it still intends to go on buying Russian oil. So these sanctions are not going to interfere with that. We could, unfortunately, see more incidents in the Baltic There have been two rather concerning incidents over the last couple of days. One in which a Russian fighter jet had to intervene when Estonian coast guards tried to impound a Russian vessel. And apparently there's been another incident about which I know a lot less, but one in which the Russians have apparently seized an Estonian ship. I am not going to discuss these incidents, worrying though they are, until I know more about them. Obviously, at the moment, I'm not able to follow the news with the level of detail that I would need to do in order to discuss these events properly. So, lots of calls, more sanctions. The sanctions, unless there is some major escalation in the Baltic, which the Americans don't seem to be keen on at all, these sanctions are going to be completely ineffective. I've had some discussions with some people on the topic of sanctions here in St. Petersburg. Again, I will discuss these. Some of the things I've learned in future programs. I should say that there is no visible sign here in St. Petersburg of the sanctions taking effect in the way that some people in the West would like them to do. I'm not saying they've been completely ineffectual. I'm just saying that there's no great sign that they've had any of the effects that people would like them to. Anyway, that's to move on. So, Europeans announcing more sanctions, the British, of course, joining in. But importantly, as the Financial Times says, no indication from Trump that he's in any mood to impose further sanctions at all. This is not what Donald Trump wants to do. It's not his intention or his objective. The Europeans are dismayed by this. And as everybody knows, putting aside whether sanctions can ever be effective in the way that people in the West believe, without the Americans, the sanctions are certain to fail. Now, I say without the Americans. There's been talk that with the Americans opposing sanctions, countries like Hungary and Slovakia might start taking steps to veto further sanctions packages which go beyond the current 17th one. The Hungarians, though, however, have approved this latest package. Just saying. It could be that at some point, if the Americans start turning against sanctions, that the Hungarians and the Slovaks and the others will start to veto renewal of sanctions. About a week ago, there was yet another article in the Financial Times which spoke of the incredible plans that the European Union is putting together to try to preserve the sanctions by getting individual states to impose them and all kinds of rules and restrictions and contracts to try and make the sanctions proof against Hungarian and Slovak vetoes. I ought to say that strictly, in terms of European law, my own personal view is that all of these ideas are wrong and make no legal sense and should fail. But of course, we now know that European law is now applied in very interesting and curious ways, and I can't pretend that I am confident that these strange devices and schemes and plans will in fact fail. Anyway, there we are. That is now the position. So the important thing to say is no sanctions for the moment, no ultimatum from the moment. Putin and Trump coming to a good understanding with each other. A Trump-Putin summit now likely. And the reason it is likely is that Putin will want to press home the advantage that he probably feels he has gained as a result of this telephone call with Trump. He will want to meet Trump. He will want to establish a relationship with Trump. It is a myth, by the way, that these two leaders have a strong relationship with each other. They have had several meetings when Trump was president before, but they've never been very long. The longest was at that very unhappy summit in Helsinki that took place, I think it was in 2018. Putin will want to go much further and beyond that. He will want to consolidate what he achieved through his telephone call yesterday by building up his relationship with Trump. And Trump, for his part, who clearly has long-term ambitions for a productive trade relationship with Russia, and a relationship with Russia that will relieve the United States of some of the excessive burden it is carrying through defending Europe, and which might also assist the United States in Trump's efforts to stabilize the wider Middle East through perhaps some kind of deal with Iran. Anyway, Trump probably is looking forward to that call, to that meeting with that end as well. Now, I ought to say that though I do believe that Putin gained quite a lot from this call, I think Trump in some ways gained at least as much and possibly even more. Trump clearly understands, at some level at least, that imposing further sanctions on Russia would be an absolutely disastrous idea, that it would destroy any prospect of a rapprochement with Russia. It would harden further still the enmity that now exists between Russia and the United States, which would work to China's advantage, and that it would probably create massive disruption and trouble in the global economy, and could lead to much higher energy costs in Europe and in the United States, leading there to higher inflation, which would be politically bad for him. 10 days ago, it looked as if the hardliners in the United States, together with the Europeans, had maneuvered Trump into a position where he was left with little option but to impose those sanctions, which he clearly didn't want to do. Well, through very deft maneuvering by Putin and by Trump, Trump has escaped, at least for the moment, having to do that thing, which, as I said, I think he knows would be bad for himself, for the United States, and for the stability of the global economy, and for international security altogether. Now, let me stress, what was achieved yesterday is one step in the right direction. It is not a giant leap. The conflict is not ended. All sorts of things could go wrong. Some things undoubtedly will go wrong. The Europeans are completely unreconciled to these forward movements which we have seen, and the enemies of that forward movement in the United States, they too have not gone away. They remain in positions of great power, and they are prepared and willing to start to push again for a return to the policy of confrontation we've been witnessing for the last 3.5 years. But it seems to me that it would be churlish not to accept also that a step forward was made yesterday. However tentative, however prone it may be to reversal, something nonetheless, at least for the moment, was achieved. Instead of a further escalation, we are seeing at the moment some revival of hope. Maybe not of peace, but of some kind of rapprochement between the American and Russian superpowers. Now, all of this continues to play out whilst the conflict in Ukraine continues to be fought. The fighting in Ukraine continues, and though I do not have details, again, I have been far too busy to get details of the fighting whilst I have been here. My impression is that we are now indeed looking at a collapse, an actual collapse of Ukrainian defences around the town of Konstantinovka in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, and around Pokrovsk. But that and much else I'm going to have to discuss in my next programme. So this is where I'm going to finish today's programme. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. And also, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. And also please remember to tick the like button and to check your video if you've liked this video. There's one, incidentally, before I completely finish, one very last thing I do want to say. A lot of people have spotted the fact, Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, has written about it, that when Donald Trump did call the European leaders, one leader he did not call was Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain. The British are putting a very brave face on this today, and, well, we can speculate as to why, but undoubtedly the British must feel very shocked by the fact that they have been left out of the discussion with the Americans up to now. I will certainly be turning to that in my next programme, and I expect that I will be discussing it in a specific programme on the Duran as well. Well, that's me for today. Be said more from me soon. Have a very good day.